Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to free yourself from perfectionism using shadow work. Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about perfectionism and where it comes from and how to use shadow work to overcome perfectionistic tendencies. Now, one thing that's really important to understand about perfectionism is that it's a symptom of a much deeper rooted dynamic. And this tends to be the case with things that spring up from the shadow. You have the symptoms, which you're largely conscious of, but then you have the deeper unconscious roots that you're not conscious of. I like to think about the shadow a bit like a root vegetable, like a carrot. So let's say that perfectionism and other symptoms of the shadow would be like the leaves of the carrot. And so those are the little green leaves that are sticking up above the surface. And if you notice, they look very different from the root of the carrot. So oftentimes the things that we see up here at the surface level are very different from the things that are actually going on down in the unconscious. But the root of the carrot would represent, in this case, the unconscious aspect that's actually relegated down into the shadow, whereas the symptom level stuff, the leaves, would just be things like perfectionism, or maybe we have other types of tendencies too, like people pleasing or some form of self-sabotage or other dynamics we don't want to be doing. But when it comes to perfectionism in particular, which is what this video is about, understand that the perfectionism is like the leaves of the carrot, but there are deeper roots that can look very different from that top level symptom. Another thing to understand about perfectionism is that it has a function. There is some way that we are trying to protect or serve ourselves by being perfectionistic or avoiding mistakes. So the very first step that we want to take when it comes to resolving perfectionist tendencies is to understand why we're doing it in the first place. And so we might ask ourselves a question like, how am I trying to protect or serve myself by being a perfectionist? Or how am I trying to protect or serve myself by avoiding making mistakes? And then depending on what the answer is that you end up getting, then you know what you need to work on to resolve the perfectionism. So in just a moment, I'm going to be giving you some examples of why perfectionism might come about and how to resolve those at the deeper roots. But first, I wanted to let you know that on April 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to be having a free live webinar called The 3 Keys to Overcoming Self-Sabotage with Shadow Work. And so if you would like to register for the free webinar, go ahead and click the link down below in the description box and just put in your name and your email. And even if you can't make it right on April 5th, just go ahead and sign up anyway, because I'll be sending out replays to everybody who signs up. But if you're interested, go ahead and sign up now and reserve your spot in the webinar. All right, so without further ado, here are some examples as to why people might procrastinate. So let's say that Billy grew up in a household where nothing that he ever did ever hit the bar for his dad. Maybe his dad had these really high expectations for him, and when Billy would come home with a 99% on the test, his dad would say, like, why not 100? So it was always this sense that the goalposts were constantly moving and he was never actually able to sort of hit the mark. And so what he internalized from that is this belief that anything that he did would never be enough, and that he has to be perfect all the time, and that mistakes are not acceptable. And so it's basically that he's expected to be perfect, and that's the baseline, and he's not going to get any further praise if he is at baseline. That's just the expectation. But if he gets even a little bit underneath perfect, like a 99%, then he's going to get a talking to. Then it's going to be disappointment. Then it's going to be all these negative consequences. So in this dynamic, Billy learned that he has a very, very narrow margin of error for even being just remotely acceptable. And there's no way to actually excel there, because perfect is just the standard. But like all people have, we have certain connection needs that have to be met and certain esteem needs that need to be met. And so what Billy sort of learned from that is that if he's not perfect, he's not going to get connection with his dad. And he also learned if he's not perfect, then he's not going to get any kind of validation. He's not going to be able to meet those esteem needs. And so he's basically there like, oh, if I'm not perfect, I can't be connected to somebody else. Or if I'm not perfect, I am not going to get any modicum of success. But then there's nothing also there to motivate him toward perfection as well, other than just this sense of not wanting to experience, let's say, rejection, or not wanting to experience invalidation. So in this case, if Billy wanted to use shadow work to resolve this issue, what he would have to become aware of is the repressed part of himself that bore the brunt of those unmet needs and the traumas around like not being, let's say, not being accepted by his dad unconditionally, and then also not getting the validation. So when we have unmet needs, we'll oftentimes repress those parts of ourselves and they'll stay there, still trying to get that need met. And when it comes to validation, we can really take this down to the existential level where we're like, oh, if I'm not able to get this validation from my parent, does it mean that I am a valid being? You know, do I get to even exist? And so it could be something like, oh, I have to be perfect or I don't get to exist. This like aspect of him that's constantly looking for the validation underneath the surface and feeling like perfectionism is at once futile, but is the only lever of power that he has to get that validation at the same time. And so he would actually have to face directly into that part of himself, become conscious of that part of himself that's still wanting his dad's validation. But instead, to be able to give himself that validation from the inside as opposed to trying to get it from the outside. And then once the inside shifts, oftentimes the outside shifts as well, where, you know, he might find that validation is much easier to come by once he actually like shifts that, not from his dad, but from other sources. All right, so let's discuss a second example. Let's say that Gemma was raised with a family of rageaholics. So everybody was really like easy to set off, and like even at the smallest things, they would get super angry. And like, let's say maybe her parents would like sort of start it on each other if they got angry, or they would even like single out one of the kids or sort of put all of that rage onto all of the kids at once. And the things that would set off Gemma's parents is if like, let's say one of the kids made a mistake, like if one of the kids accidentally dropped something, or things weren't going perfectly, that would be enough to kind of create this tension and this ripple effect that would lead to all of this rage around Gemma. And so in order to protect herself, she developed these like perfectionistic tendencies where it's like, okay, don't try anything unless you can do it 100% perfectly. So she has this all or nothing tendency where it's like, if I can't do something 100% perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. And that's because there's still part of her that's trying to avoid being on the receiving end of that rage and all of the negative emotions that come up as a result of that. And so in order to avoid, let's say, maybe shame or fear that comes up about like, you know, in relation to being a child on the receiving end of her parents' rage, she would actually have to get used to facing into those very difficult, uncomfortable emotions. And that's where the shadow work would come in. She'd have to become conscious of the traumas around being on the receiving end of rage and be able to sit with those feelings until they were able to be processed through. Because right now her nervous system is really sensitive to any sign that she's making a mistake because she's been conditioned to associate mistakes with being on the receiving end of all that negativity. So those feelings of fear and shame would have to be processed through on the level of the nervous system using somatic work and body scan meditation. And then after those feelings have been processed through, that sort of takes the sting out of like making mistakes. She can also get more and more used to making mistakes and feeling okay with it so that she starts to decouple the experience of making mistakes from that sort of almost remembered experience from childhood. All right, and my final example that I'll give here is, let's say that Victor grew up in a household with 10 brothers and sisters. And so he was one of many, and his parents didn't have a lot of time. They both worked, and so they didn't have a lot of time to spend with the kids. And if any of the kids were going to get their parents' attention, they had to do something excellent. Like they had to get like 100% on their math test, or they had to, you know, do something that was like, you know, just beyond. Because if it was just the normal thing, they wouldn't get any attention from the parents. Like the parents didn't have a lot of time or a lot of bandwidth for the kids, and there was a lot of kids to spread that attention around to. And so basically all of the kids learned that they needed to compete for their parents' attention in order to get that. And so Victor was always having to think about where he sort of stood with regard to the rest of his siblings and trying to be more and more perfect and more spectacular than they are. And this set up a dynamic for Victor on into adulthood where he would give his all and like try to be as perfect as possible, but then he would also burn out and hold himself back and end up in these patterns of self-sabotage because part of him couldn't handle the pressure of, oh, if I can't do this, then I can't get that connection or that love from my parents. And so in this case, Victor is dealing with a chronically unmet need for connection and attention from his parents. And so if he were to use shadow work, what he would have to do is to become conscious of the part of himself that's looking for attention and connection, and tune deeply into that part of himself to give that to himself from the inside by connecting with that aspect of himself that feels starved of those needs. And to be able to, let's say, kind of notice all of the vulnerabilities that are there in his maybe competitive nature, or in his, let's say, tendency to want to achieve, or his tendency to want to be perfect. And with this, there can be elements of like sitting with feelings like loneliness and like being unseen. So again, that's like that somatic work, sitting directly with those feelings. But there can also be just dynamics where a part of himself is like consistently like desperate for a certain need for connection. And maybe oftentimes we go unconscious to those parts. So he might even have some blocks to connection that are coming up, sort of as a secondary symptom beyond just the perfectionism. So he would have to actually like work through each of those blocks and like remedy those using the shadow work process. All right, so those are a few examples of why people might engage in perfectionism, but there are so many different reasons that could be. But it all starts with asking yourself. If you notice yourself engaging in perfectionistic tendencies, ask yourself the question, in what ways am I trying to protect or serve myself by being a perfectionist? Or in what ways am I trying to protect or serve myself by avoiding making mistakes? You might even ask yourself questions like, oh, if I made a mistake, what would be so bad about that? And then you might come up with another answer. And then you ask yourself, oh, well, what would be so bad about that? So for example, it's like, oh, what would be so bad about making mistakes? It's like, oh, well, others would criticize me. Well, what would be so bad about that? Well, if others criticize me, then I'm not going to be able to like connect with them, and maybe it's going to mess up the relationship. And okay, what would be so bad about that? Well, then I would be alone. And okay, what would be so bad about that? And I want to keep drawing that down until I find the root of the reason why I'm trying to protect myself with that perfectionism. So understanding that perfectionism is a symptom and a protection mechanism can really help you sort of use that to draw it down and understand it at a deep level till you find the root cause, and then you can resolve the root cause right at the core of what it is. And resolving the root cause will vary from person to person. Sometimes it has to do with facing into uncomfortable emotions. Sometimes it has to do with becoming conscious of certain needs, removing the barriers to those needs and meeting them. But then there can also be other things like shifting around certain mindsets, or let's say changing your identity up, changing your worldview up, let's say expanding your paradigm. So there's a variety of different ways that you can actually work to integrate these aspects, and it just depends from, let's say, depending on what you get with your answer of how you're trying to protect yourself with perfectionism, that's going to determine how you resolve those issues at the deepest levels. All right, so that's all for now. Again, if you would like to register for my free live webinar on April 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern, again, that's the 3 keys to overcoming self-sabotage with shadow work. So if you want to check that out, go ahead and register at the link down below in the description. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me at thediamondnetchannel@gmail.com. And that's all for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.